Welcome to the Authority Podcast, Plumbing and Mechanical. When talking about the built environment, we would do well to remember, we shape our buildings, and afterwards, our buildings shape us. Therefore, on each episode, we'll discuss the latest trends from IAPMO in plumbing and mechanical safety, sustainability, and resiliency. Join me, your host, Christoph Lohr, and together we'll explore the ways we can make our buildings shape us for the better. And welcome back to the Authority Podcast, Plumbing and Mechanical. I'm your host, Christoph Lohr, and on this week's episode, we're going to be talking about how Seattle improved water savings and reduced new construction costs through accurate pipe sizing. Seattle recently mandated the use of the IAPMO Water Demand Calculator for multifamily residences, also known as R2 occupancies. The inclusion of Appendix M in the city's plumbing codes puts Seattle on the cutting edge of sustainability and resiliency by creating a pathway for significant reductions in potable water use, improving energy, as well as significant reductions in new construction costs. Joining me for this episode is first Steven Hart, Chief of the Plumbing and Gas Piping Program in Public Health for Seattle and King County. Steve, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Christoph. Glad to be here.
And also joining us on this doubleheader is Duane Jonlin, FAIA, Energy Code and Energy Conservation Advisor for the City of Seattle Department of Construction and Inspections. And he was directly involved with the requirement to use Appendix M for multifamily in Seattle. Duane, really glad to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Well, for our listeners, let's dive right in. So when, this is a new requirement. This is, to our knowledge, this is the first time anywhere in the U.S. that there's a mandate to utilize the water demand calculator. And I think, Duane, I'll drive this first question at you. What drove the decision to update the way Seattle plumbing professionals size their pipes?
Well, this calculator is all around apartment buildings, multifamily buildings that use low flow fixtures, that they don't need as much water. So the fact that our state has requirements in that are stringent for low flow fixtures for multifamily buildings already means that we're already there for that requirement, and the energy savings were terrific. And the fact that we're getting energy savings and construction cost savings in the same bundle is a pretty special deal. So that was pretty much a no-brainer.
Why mandate it? Why not just promote the availability of an updated sizing calculation?
Yeah, I'm always poking fun at mechanical engineers for being so habit bound. I think nobody's phone ever rang on the weekend because somebody's heating capacity was oversized, right? So there's always a tendency to want to err on the side of caution. And in this case, this rule change prods the whole industry, engineers and builders, into moving up to a higher level of performance, maybe out of their comfort zone at first.
Is, similar concept. There's always that inclination to add a safety factor on top of a safety factor. And the oversizing, we know from the California Energy Commission that Hunter's curve is, in like a multifamily building can be like as much as 25x. That's not 25%, but 25x, so 25 times oversized. So it sounds like you guys were considering that or looking at some of at least similar concepts.
There's kind of a trickle down, mechanism here that's happening. And when there are codes that change and have a significant impact, the outside entities that have to introduce these into their design, meaning those that are the design professionals, want to know exactly what a government organization like ours here in Seattle is going to look for. What would we want to have you provide to us so that we can be comfortable that you have met all the criterion within the requirements of Appendix M using a water demand calculator? So for that to happen, everybody has to get educated. And we try to do that simultaneously. So here coming up in a couple months, we've actually tried to introduce not only the inspection part of our program, as well as the professional part of the industry to collaborate in a shared arena and environment to have one collective training. And we hope to do this more than once for those that couldn't make it the first time. But it is a shared environment, so it's a back and forth, and it would make somebody apprehensive as to know how far to stretch this thing out and how much effort should they put into creating design documents for a government, review and organization like ours, who will also be doing the inspecting.
Definitely. And I think that date, Steve, I think we had set on was February 17th. Is that correct?
That is. We're going to have a training on February 17th at Green River College in Auburn, Washington. And it's going to be about a 4-5 hour event. It depends on how lengthy we get into discussions. But again, I think what I've noticed when we've had discussions regarding Appendix M is there's this continual kind of apprehensiveness to when you say to somebody, well, you now have a 6-inch water supply that can be reduced down to a 4-inch water supply. Same structure, same fixtures. And there's a lot of apprehension about I'm going to use empirical data and say 6-inch works, but I don't have anything for 4-inch. But in fact, that's kind of not really true, because there is a very large, lengthy study of multiple structures over a significant amount of years to identify the actual use of Appendix M.
So one question before we move on in terms of a little bit more on that retraining of Seattle plumbing professionals. Let me ask this question in terms of, we talked about why mandate it, but one more follow-up question I wanted to ask on that is why mandate it for multifamily and specifically target like apartments, condos, that kind of building? I'm assuming it's because of larger pipe sizes, you would have a much more disparate impact than if it was just on a single family home.
This is specifically for multifamily that uses low flow fixtures is what
Gotcha.
Appendix M works for.
Oh, I guess so. I mean, it would also work for a single family home. I mean, Appendix M can work for single family, but the mandate is only for multifamily. And I'm assuming it's because of the larger water systems in play in multifamily. That was why that was targeted as part of the mandate and not single family.
Seattle, in Washington State, the local jurisdictions are not allowed to make changes to the single family residential part of the energy code. So, or to the residential building code. So anything like that, we have to do at the state level.
Understood. Okay, that is helpful context to know. All right, so switching gears back to the plumbing training side. Steve, you mentioned a little bit about some of those opportunities, but it sounds like, is there anything else you want to mention about retraining or any other anticipated needs in retraining Seattle plumbing professionals to be more comfortable with using the water demand calculator?
I think anytime that you look at something that's new, first you have to understand it and then get the historical context of why it's being introduced and why we're going to transition from what we currently use to what we're going to eventually use as a continuance of water supply systems going forward. And to do that, it takes multiple trainings, not only, like I say, again, on the design side and on the building department side, where there's going to be inspections of that category of those water supply systems and the review of those water supply systems. It takes a lot of training, and that training has to take time to sink in. And not everybody's going to grasp this the first time. So there's going to be more than one training. There's going to be a lot of dialogue and crosstalk and communication regarding about questions that need to be either answered through our process in and on our website, like a frequently asked question venue, just tailored for Appendix M. So that way we have somebody who is maybe familiar but not entirely with Appendix M, that we can, deflect some of those questions through an FAQ process and give a little bit more comfort and a little bit more reassurance, and where maybe they're lacking in a little bit of knowledge or training, that it's at their availability.
Definitely. Well, and I know, IAPMO, we are definitely committed to helping you all make it a success. As mentioned, we're going to be helping do that training on February 17th, that Saturday. And then there's plenty of other opportunities in terms of past classes and recordings on IAPMO Learn for folks to access too. But whether it's live or recorded or otherwise training, definitely excited to make sure this is a success for you all in Seattle, King County.
And I'd like to say,
go ahead, Duane. Go ahead.
I'm not worried about the kind of people that show up at IAPMO events or other things that Steve organizes for plumbing professionals like that. It's those smaller outfits that are not part of any of these societies, that are just working on their own, that are going to be the ones with unhappy faces up at the permit desk when they get turned away for doing what they've always been doing. And yeah. I don't know the best way to get out and reach those people. It might be through the vendors of gear that since everybody has to deal with them, that we can somehow get the notice out that life is changing.
That's a great point, Duane. I was going to ask, and my sense is too, it's going to be difficult to get out to everybody, right? To get that message out to everyone, especially if they're not paying attention. And it might be, the education might be on the back end, unfortunately. And that's just one of those costs of doing business in a certain way. That you might not be on the up and up when changes like this happen. So, but I was gonna say, I imagine you guys have pretty good communications department. So hopefully at least they're paying attention to building code changes as they come out. Well, let's wrap this up with just a couple more questions here. So I guess this first one I want to point at, maybe Steve, if you want to start, and then Duane, you want to chime in on, is, what would you say to other jurisdictions facing, water shortages? They're trying to reduce their energy consumption. They have housing affordability issues. What advice or guidance or what would you say to them? If they're thinking about those kind of things.
I think communication is the beginning step. You were just talking about how is the industry going to know that we've made this transition. Our program does a newsletter. We do it often, and we incorporate our government partners as well as our local partners like MCA and PHCC and ASPE and ASHRAE and the local IAPMO chapter. So we have a very, solid connection with, industry partners as well as government partners to share the word and the knowledge that, exactly what is happening and what's going to happen in the near future. But aside all of that communication, when you're talking about somebody who's thinking about doing something like this, one of the first approaches is to first identify, is this a benefit to my community? And how can my community benefit from a different style or type of water supply system? If you're a community that is struggling financially in a city or town, and you need to find some mechanism to reduce the cost of, let's just say, affordable housing, you may want to look into this opportunity because cutting across the board, it has all these trailers to it that, as Duane mentioned earlier, from smaller pipe size to smaller core hole drills to smaller plumbing chases to smaller insulation size. And then all of that translates into the economic factor of it, less costly in an installation format as well as in the overall maintenance of such a system. So when you're talking about should my community approach this, there's some qualifying questions that you should ask yourself in your community. Is this a benefit to our community? And then approach it from that going forward.
And I'd add that first off, if you're not in a state that requires low flow fixtures, you'd need to ensure that the apartment builders were using those, which is getting to be pretty normal now across the board as those fixtures have gotten to be better. But then this is one of those really rare opportunities that in one jump you can reduce water use and energy use, carbon emissions, and construction cost all in one go. I think anybody that's not jumping at this chance is going to look pretty foolish a few years down the road.
And when you're saying this chance, Duane, you're talking about specifically adoption of Appendix M, right sizing water demand calculator. Excellent. Well, that is, I think, a great way to close out the main questions. Just one last question before we go, and that is, I would say first off, I've really enjoyed our conversation here. I've learned a lot from you, Steve, and you as well, Duane, and really appreciate you sharing your time. Would love to have you guys on the podcast again sometime in the future. Let's say it's a year from now. What do you think we're talking about in 1 year from now? And I'll start with maybe Steve, and then I'll go to you, Duane, or vice versa. Either way, whichever one you guys wants to jump first on that.
Well, I think in a year from now, we're going to be talking about the reduction of the size of drain, waste, and vent systems, because the correlation of the factor of a reduced water supply system may not change the probability of the use of that water supply system in the discharges. But if the loading was comparable to a larger size system, then if you reduce that water supply system, I think what you're going to discover is that the drain, waste, and vent system was oversized to begin with.
On the residential. I think that makes sense, Steve. That's actually in Appendix C of the UPC. That's one that I've been exploring quite a bit, the drainage there. And it's been interesting at the opportunity there too. Duane, what about you? Well,
we have also in this area mandates going into effect that your water heating is going to be done by heat pump in Seattle and in Washington State. And as that gets more real, the projects progress to the point where they're starting to install these systems. We'll be looking at what the professionals out there have figured out as the most economical and sensible way to install these systems and any words to the wise that they might have for us.
Excellent. Well, on behalf of IAPMO and the Authority Podcast, Plumbing and Mechanical, I just want to say thank you, Steve. Thank you, Duane. Really appreciate the time today and look forward to having you on in the future.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us on this week's episode of the Authority Podcast, Plumbing and Mechanical. Love this episode of the podcast? Head over to iTunes to subscribe, rate, and leave a review. Please follow us on Twitter @AuthorityPM, on Instagram @TheAuthorityPodcast, or email us at iapmo@iapmo.org. Join us next time for another episode of the Authority Podcast, Plumbing and Mechanical. In the meantime, let's work together to make our buildings more resilient and shape us for the better.